Okay, so this is from Notes for a Special Issue. Our 21st century users of social media, email, and cell phones have nothing on second and third wave lesbian feminists when it comes to social networking. Making Connections, the 5th special issue of Sinister Wisdom from the Southern Lesbian Feminist Activist Herstory Project, tells stories of some of the ways that lesbians all over the South during the last half of the 20th century connected with each other for fun and activism through the old-fashioned communication systems of feminist bookstores and publishers, writing groups, newsletters, and newspapers. Making Connections begins with stories of the feminist booksellers who nurtured the writing groups, distributed the newsletters, and always provided community space for lesbian culture. Now a vanishing breed, feminist bookstores once numbered over 100 locations in the United States and Canada. Today, only 4 remain in the South. Bookwoman and Resistencia Books, both in Austin, Texas, The Bag Lady in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Charis Books and More, the oldest remaining feminist bookseller in the country, now in Decatur, Georgia, outside of Atlanta. During the heyday, when there were over 100 feminist booksellers nationwide, they were connected by the Feminist Bookstore Network and Feminist Bookstore News, with Carol C.J. in California at the heart of the networking. Rose Norman and Carol C.J. will read tonight from a story about the feminist bookstore movement in the South. And tonight's readings will also include stories of 2 bookstores. Woody Blue will read about Faye Williams' Washington, D.C. store, Sister Space and Books, and E.R. Anderson will read from the story about Atlanta's Charis Books and More. Making Connections also includes stories about feminist publishing. Nancy Blood writes about the Whole Woman Press in North Carolina, and Jamie Harker writes about feminist publishers in the South and their connection to the women in print movement. Our stories of lesbian feminist writing groups begins with Woman Rights, the Southeast Lesbian Writers Conference, which spawned writing groups around the South for 40 years and gave birth to this Herstory project. The 6 stories of lesbian feminist writing groups in this issue all acknowledge a debt to woman rights, which in 2019 split into 2 new groups and retired the name. You can find those 2 new groups at dykewriters.com and outrageousvoices.com. Like feminist bookstores, printed feminist newspapers and newsletters proliferated all over the country during the last decades of the 20th century before going online. We have individual stories and a timeline about these newsletters and newspapers. And tonight, Lorraine Fontana will read Elizabeth Knowlton's story about Atlanta, the newsletter of the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance, known as ALPHA. ALPHA collected feminist newsletters from all over the country, eventually donating 800 grassroots newsletters spanning the years from 1972 to 1994 to Duke University. And this issue also includes a story about that unique collection. It is sad that so many feminist newsletters, bookstores, and publishers are gone, now relics of a generation remembered warmly by aging lesbians who were in many different ways at the forefront of lesbian feminist activism for decades. The stories in Sinister Wisdom 116, Making Connections, are a record of amazing acts of bravery, creativity, and hard work to express and share new lesbian thought. Today's busy feminists are rooted in and informed by the work of that generation. Fortunately, Charis, Bookwoman, Resistencia Books, Baglading, and many lesbian writing groups continue. And some lesbian feminist newsletters survive through various online options less costly than printing and mailing. The future of all of these is uncertain as we face backlash and polarizing arguments that split even so small a group as lesbian feminists. We take heart from collecting and reading these stories and from the endless ingenuity and forward thinking we find in the lesbian community. We hope you find our stories heartening too. If you have a story inside you, please send it our way. The project is ongoing and we're collecting stories. Email to uppercase SLFA lowercase Herstory project. That's all one word, uppercase SLFA lowercase Herstory project @gmail.com. All the material will be archived in total and available at the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at Duke University.
All right, thank you so much, Merril.
Got mute again.
I think I got you. All right. Next, we're gonna bring up Gail Reeder. Gail Reeder was an Army brat who became a grassroots organizer for racial justice and a writer of feminist and anti-war articles when she returned home to North Carolina. These days, she lives in Atlanta and is more dangerous with a pickaxe than a gun, but she is keeping an eye on the revolution. She's reading her poem, Hide and Seek. Please welcome Gail Reeder. Try and unmute yourself one more time, Gail. There you go.
All right, wonderful. The poem is called Hide and Seek, and we've been selecting poems to set the tone for the volumes that we've been writing. So this one comes from my Southern childhood and adulthood. Cicadas vibrate at twilight to fireflies caught in mason jars. Flickering lights released in the night, seeking and sparkling. So we seek one another, each shining in our special way. 5th grade fire drill, close in unlit hallways, cotton dresses, bare legs almost touching, leg hairs waving with electricity, tingling in hidden places. Whispering to doodlebugs in the shadows under the porch, sharing warm breath and secrets, waiting for birds at sunrise in the wet grass, embracing beneath a canopy of shooting stars. The darkness is our friend. Quilting women gather, a dinner table of fabric between them, silent in the closeness, making comfort while comforting. We would have joined them, but we are not welcome here. Their needles flash in the light. The South has not been kind to us. We have nudged politely for our place, for we were raised with manners, saying, "Yes, ma'am," and "thank you," and kindness, a bless her heart to the special ones less able. These values came into the struggle with us. For where do we go when our churches and families turn us away? We flee to baseball for hidden fun under the bleachers, to bookstores exploring between the racks, to political campaigns desperate for change. We meet in writers' circles, witches' circles, feminist circles. We are a well-rounded group of refugees. Potluck suppers recall family reunions under the pecan trees. We recreate the familial closeness with our own clubs and gatherings. In celebration, we share the love that is ours and hope for a brighter future where darkness is no longer a necessity.
Thank you, Gail. Next up, we have Rose Norman and Carol CJ. Rose Norman is one of the co-editors of this special series. She's a retired professor of English and Women's Studies. Her lifelong interest in women's lives and stories led her to work with the Southern lesbian feminist activist Herstory project, where she has had the privilege of interviewing more than 100 lesbians. She's joined by Carol CJ, who was the beating heart of the Feminist Bookstore news and a primary connector in the Feminist Bookstore network. Together, they will share excerpts from Rose's piece, "You Had to Be Passionate and Crazy, Feminist Bookstores in the South." Please welcome Rose and Carol.
Am I on? You had to be passionate and crazy. That's a quotation from Cookie Tear, who owned Southern Sisters in Durham, North Carolina. For Cookie Tear, as for most second wave feminists, bookstores were a crucial part of building feminist community and networking. Feminist bookstores have been important sites of lesbian feminist activism since the first stores began opening all over the country in the 1970s. They were information centers that carried books and newspapers and journals celebrating women that were otherwise not available locally. Their bulletin boards publicized local events, and they sold tickets to concerts by feminist singers. They provided space as an alternative to the bars where women could hang out and meet other lesbians, and for organizing. People would call the bookstores seeking roommates, health care, counseling for domestic violence, emergency housing. The list was as endless as women's needs. I have been interviewing feminist booksellers about the feminist bookstore movement since 2000, the year 2000. For this issue, I wrote about 21 of the feminist bookstores in the South during the last 3 decades of the 20th century. Tonight, I want to focus on the parts of that story describing what happened to the feminist bookstore movement over those decades. I am joined by Carol CJ, who played a big role in building that movement and keeping it alive during those decades through Feminist Bookstore News and her work in the Feminist Bookstore Network. Carol read multiple drafts of this story and in many ways lived the story it tells. The number of feminist bookstores peaked at about 130 in the United States and Canada by 1996. That's as reported in Feminist Bookstore News. By the year 2000, the total was down to 74, and feminist publishers and presses were closing as well. Feminist Bookstore News, founded in 1976, also became unsustainable that year due to decline in advertising from mainstream publishers. By the spring of 2019, when I last checked, the count of feminist bookstores was down to about 20 in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. During the last 3 decades of the 20th century, Southern states were home to at least 48 feminist bookstores, and we provide a timeline of them with this essay. 4 of those stores remain open today. Charis Books and More, now in Decatur, the oldest of them, with Bookwoman in Austin, a close second. Also in Austin is Resistencia Bookstore, an example of the kind of movement-oriented store that fits the description of a feminist bookstore in goals, ownership, and stock, but is often overlooked in counting. The Bag Lady in Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the last founded in the 20th century, is also often overlooked, maybe because it has always included a heavy emphasis on what for most booksellers are sidelines, crystals, incense, tarot cards, jewelry. But it won an award as Charlotte's best bookstore in 2018. Here, Carol CJ picks up the story.
Carol, you're muted. Unmute and start
Okay.
again.
Okay, thank you, Rose. I'm honored to be at Charis Bookstore tonight and to be a part of this celebration of Southern feminist bookstore history, and to celebrate this wonderful issue of Sinister Wisdom and all the bookstore stories and tales, interviews, and research it includes. It's such a wonderful body of work and a gift to us all. I kind of feel like I'm representing all the feminist booksellers who are here and the books and who worked through the second wave, and also the current generation of booksellers. And I have to say, that's a very delicious sensation, especially in this moment of political uprising and demand for social change. And I know that all of the work of every feminist bookseller has done or is doing has helped to build toward this moment of demand for change and racial justice. And I'm so grateful for your work. But let's go back to the past for the moment. Like independent bookstores all over the country, feminist booksellers struggled as bookselling was colonized by corporate chain bookstores in the 1980s and 90s. At the same time, large corporations were buying up publishing companies. In keeping with their goals, maximizing profits for their shareholders, they've published fewer titles, focusing instead on bestsellers rather than on publishing and marketing a wider diversity of books. These corporate publishers also gave preferential treatment or preferential discounts to corporate bookstore chain stores, thus charging them less money for the exact same books than they charged feminist and other independent bookstores. Feminist bookselling also had its own special challenges. Feminist bookstores often valued activism over making money and were primarily interested in sharing ideas and information and in creating a space for feminist empowerment and community. Many of the women who launched feminist bookstores had little business experience, even as many booksellers were or became financial wizards and managed to hold it all together financially while being so activist. I'll warrant that most would agree with the statement from First Things First's 1975 newsletter. For women to build a realistic economic base, we must realize that our skills are not for free, i.e., not worthless. We must support ourselves as workers. And so, in the 70s, at a time when the world of work was still doing its best to keep its doors closed to women, we had to figure out how to support ourselves to do this work. But despite all the challenges, feminist bookstores, because of our deep, committed communities, had a significantly higher survival rate than general independent bookstores did at the time. Well, until Amazon.com began marketing specifically and successfully to lesbian and gay and feminist readers and organizations, many of whom initially thought that, what's this Amazon.com thing, was just another successful project of Amazon, the feminist bookstore in Minneapolis, rather than being a greed-driven corporation that had no qualms about stealing and using Amazon's name and stealing its customers. Pokey Anderson, a lifelong activist who co-owned Inkling's Bookshop in Houston from 1988 to 1998, describes the relationship of feminist bookstores to community building. Feminist bookstores need various things to exist: actual places to meet, communication systems like radio programs and newsletters, and entertainment and culture, bars, concerts, poetry readings, baseball and basketball teams, ways to bring people together in harmony with who they are and why they're here. Bookstores function as a lot of these things, she says, as a way of communicating, as community centers, and they help build the rest of the infrastructure. As an activist for all of these years, she continues, I know you can create wonderful things out of the trunk of your car, but at some point, to get traction and build community, there have to be things like employees and spaces we can depend on. On the internet, it's easy to feel you're connected, but when it comes down to it, there are things a virtual community can't do that a flesh and blood community can. And that's what a feminist bookstore is, flesh and blood community. Flesh and blood community is what Black feminist scholar Alexis Pauline Gumbs found at Charis Bookstore and more in the 1990s. Gumbs was only 14 in 1996 when the feminist bookstore movement was peaking, but she had the good fortune to find the Young Women's Writing Group, sponsored by Charis's new programming and fundraising organization, the Charis Circle. That youthful experience was so important to her that she has launched all of her books from Charis, though she's not lived in Atlanta since high school. She credits becoming a Black feminist to the collected poems of Audre Lorde, whose books she found there. Those weekly Young Women's Writing Group meetings provided her with a grounding context, seeing her own writing in a communal space, surrounded by her peers and by the works of other women writers.
Hello, Charis family and Sinister Wisdom loved ones. I'm Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and I'm really excited to be able to virtually be part of the celebration of this beautiful, necessary archive. I am going to need to specifically read this interview excerpt because I could go on for days and years and lifetimes about how much Charis means to me, how important it is to have feminist bookstore spaces, but there's an incredible program and I am going to focus. So this is part of the interview. When I was in the Charis Young Women's Writers Group in high school, we met in what was really a storage closet. It was where they stored the books that weren't on the shelf yet, or sometimes the piles of books that were for the Emory Women's Studies classroom orders. Of course, they were amazing books, like Sister Outsider. And sometimes we would just open a book and take a line out of that book to prompt us for our writing after school. Linda Bryant, co-founder, co-owner of Charis Books, started the Young Women's Writers Group and facilitated it when I was in high school. And Linda is a really important mothering figure for me and for everyone else who was in the group. It was really incredible to have a space to learn about feminism, a place that has so much diverse participation from different feminists, and it was an inherently intergenerational space, of course. Charis Circle did that on purpose with the Young Women's Writers Group and the wonderful children's literature section, and you would see families at the store. And this is part of what was really important to me, that my family could share the space of a feminist bookstore with me. My family was really excited anytime I would be sharing my writing, and so it would be a whole family event. My parents, my siblings, they all came when Writers Group did readings, and so I saw my family in feminist spaces over and over again. That was really important for me, and for my family to be able to grow in ways that supported me. writers who came to do readings at Charis often also did workshops for our writers group. And the things that Shay Youngblood, Asha Bandale, and others, Nikki Finney, taught me about writing when I was a teenager are still actually part of my daily practice right now. And I now realize that that level of access was very rare. It's like the reason that people go get MFAs so they could be around someone like Nikki Finney or Shay Youngblood or Asha Bandale. And we were so lucky to grow up thinking that, that we could have that access for free in high school in our hometown. I think what I got at Charis was really access to that explicit tradition of what it looks like to live inside the ideas that are in Black feminist books. What does that mean as a practice? How do I see myself as a co-creator of that, not just a consumer of it? That's the thing for me that makes feminist bookstores incredible institutions. They are bookstores, but it's not just a place that you go to consume. It's a place you go to understand that you're regenerating a tradition. You're part of a tradition. Why are we buying feminist children's books? Because we actually are producing feminism into the future. There's a commitment that goes with that. That's something that I'm still understanding the value of in more and more ways. And I'm so grateful for each of you, everyone who put this event together, this beautiful archive, and I am excited about it going far and wide. I know that Charis is an inspiration for so many folks who want to have feminist bookstores in their communities. I know that all of the other feminist bookstores that have transformed even my own life, I'm thinking Toronto Women's Bookstore, need to be remembered, because that tradition of practice must go forward, even in different forms. So thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this celebration. Thank you so much for the diligent space you create for feminism all the time. Thank you for your love. And I hope to get to see all of you in other forms, in other ways, on other days, as soon as possible. Much love. Mwah.
Thank you, Alexis. If they don't take time to look, it's easy for historians to assume that the various feminist movements, including feminist bookstores, were primarily or exclusively composed of white women. But a closer look claims Black and Latino ownership of at least 4 Southern stores: Sister Space in DC, Las Mujeres and Textures, both in San Antonio, and Resistencia in Austin, and also co-ownership for a time of Lama's bookstores in DC and Baltimore. And of course, many stores included Black staff, including key staff members, not to mention customers and community. Preceding and then concurrent with the women's liberation and feminist bookstore movements was the Black liberation bookstore movement. Many of these bookstores were owned or co-owned, managed, and staffed by Black women. Sometimes Black feminists and Black lesbians felt more at home in one strand of the wider community bookstore movement than in the other. Or the same woman might feel more comfortable in one place at one time, and then at another point of her life, or in another mood, find more comfort in the other thread. And of course, many women claim both threads as vital parts of their lives and heritage. And of course, Black bookstores' understanding of and embracing of feminism and the Black lesbian movements evolved over time, just as feminist bookstores' understanding of racism and our integration of anti-racist work evolved and deepened over time. And now we go back to Rose.
Thank you, Carol. After so many years of feminist bookstores closing, it is refreshing that we are now seeing new ones. Two young women in Birmingham, Alabama, Katie Willis and Megan Lyle, started the Burdock Bookstore Collective as a pop-up feminist bookstore, and then found a home for it at the Quaker Meeting House. Alexis Pauline Gomes, we just heard from, and her life partner have started the Black Feminist Bookmobile in Durham, North Carolina, creating pop-up reading rooms in parks and other spaces. With the opening of Alsace Wallentin's Tombola Books, tombolabooks.com, in St. Petersburg last December, Florida is no longer without a feminist bookstore. And Jamie Harker opened Violet Valley Books in Warda Valley near Oxford, Mississippi. These are all examples of today's young feminists who seem to have the same brilliance and optimism that inspired that earlier wave of feminist booksellers to empower and transform women's lives through books.
Thank you, Rose. Now we're going to invite Woody Blue up to read a piece about Faye Williams. So Woody Blue lives and works in Gainesville, Florida, and became involved in radical peace and lesbian communities during the 1980s at the Seneca Women's Peace Encampment and the National LGBT Marches in Washington. She'll read an excerpt of her interview with Faye Williams, who is the founder of Sister Space and Books. Please welcome Woody Blue.
When the AIDS epidemic spread throughout the country, Sister Space and Books distributed pamphlets and educational materials. This did not sit well with a Black preacher in the neighborhood, who visited the store and made disparaging remarks to Faye on more than one occasion. One day, she had had enough of it. She marched to Sunday service at his church. Once the crowd settled in, she stood in the aisle and told the preacher she would out him if he ever came by her store again. The congregation scratched their heads over that one, and after the service, made a beeline to her store. Though it was difficult for Faye, a Black woman, to confront a Black preacher in his church, Faye explained why she did it. By standing up to that preacher, she had discouraged other preachers in town from condemning her, the LGBT community, and the store from their pulpits. Meanwhile, she chided the other Black churches for attacking her rather than concentrating on the AIDS epidemic. Faye had opened the bookstore in 1994, but there were a few problems with the landlord. Faye was paying $2,500 a month, but the air conditioning and heat didn't work properly and needed repair. The landlord refused to fix it. After 2 years, Faye began to put her rent into an escrow account. The landlord filed suit. It took 5 years to come to court. 3 nationally renowned law firms represented her pro bono, and Faye continued building her business. Faye was well prepared and kept the paperwork in a storage unit next door with other extra books from the store. Shortly before the court date, the storage unit flooded, and most of the documentation was destroyed. The judge was sympathetic and remarked that he would have to regretfully rule against her because of inadequate documentation. "You will have to leave," he said, "though I know you are doing a good job." "You'll have to throw me out because I'm not leaving," retorted Faye. "We will throw you out," replied the judge. The day of reckoning came while Faye's mother was visiting on vacation. When the marshals drove up, Faye sent her mother to sit on the rocking chair next door with the money from the store. Then she called the local radio station, WPFW 89.3 FM, the indie station, and asked them to send help. They put the call out, and within a few minutes, the street was blocked with people coming to help. One of the marshals, a Black woman, refused to evict Faye. Instead, she got in her car and drove away. Faye refused to walk out, so they dragged her out. Surrounded by the crowd, they were afraid to arrest her. The marshals went to the day laborers on the corner to get help moving Faye's stuff out. The day laborers refused. The marshals found other, more day laborers. Meanwhile, Faye called for trucks and boxes. When Sister Space and Books supporters arrived, they packed all the boxes and moved them to a storage area. Despite being evicted that day, Faye had an event to attend. It was a book signing for Charles Ogletree, the lawyer for Anita Hill. Faye, 4 volunteers, and her mother, Mrs. Ruby Williams, sold 300 books that day. Sister Space went out of commission for a few months while Faye regrouped. But the eviction of Sister Space and Books from that prime piece of property intimidated the whole neighborhood. Buildings that had been part of the neighborhood were snatched up quickly as gentrification happened throughout the area. Faye found another building near Howard University on Georgia Avenue in 2009. It was a good location, but there was no parking, no nearby subway station, and only 400 square feet of space. She still had the conventional book selling, but could not get speakers. Times had changed. After 2 years, she closed the doors on Sister Space and Books and moved back home to Gainesville, Florida. Faye now lives in Gainesville in Porter's Quarters, the African-American neighborhood in which she was raised. She is in the process of opening up a community center called Mama's Club, Music, Art, Movement, Action. She is organizing to fight the gentrification of her neighborhood by the University of Florida. She recently led the relocation of a Confederate statue from downtown Gainesville, and she is currently leading the way to rename a few elementary schools that are named after Confederate bigwigs. Today, Faye would have been here reading her story, but she couldn't because she's marching downtown as we speak. And afterwards, there's a rally, and she's going to be the speaker at that rally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Woody. Our next speaker is Lorraine Fontana. Lorraine is an active contributor to many intersecting feminist, queer, anti-war, and anti-racist movements for justice in Atlanta, Georgia. She's reading a piece by our Charis friend, Elizabeth Knowlton, about Atalanta.
Hi, thanks, ER. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say that I wish Elizabeth Knowlton were here reading us herself. I am one of the founding mothers, as we call ourselves, of Alpha, and Elizabeth joined us after the first couple of years Alpha existed when she moved to Atlanta, and she was instrumental in creating a more functioning library and starting an archives, which eventually then was given to Duke University when Alpha closed. And so this is her piece called Atalanta. The first issue of the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance newsletter appeared in September 1973 and began on the Sunday meeting a few weeks ago. The frustrations we've all felt over the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance's Alpha's inability to get herself together were verbalized. I chuckle now reading it, for although I did not move into Atlanta until a year later, this was always a frustration many of us had, mostly because we had such high expectations of what lesbian feminists could do. Alpha survived for 22 years, 1972 through 94, primarily because we were open to whatever members wanted to work on. We had no board of officers, rather we worked through the committee system. Any committee's existence depended on the women interested. One of the few committees to last from the first issue until Alpha folded was the newsletter committee. It is almost as if no organization exists without communication to its members and the world. Whereas nowadays, the internet or glossy magazines keep us up to date about the variety of liberal to radical organizations. Back then, we were dependent on the mimeograph machine. Ah, the thunder of the machine in the cold, dark Alpha House kitchen. It was enough to warm our souls, if not our hands, as we munched on bananas and bagels with cream cheese. For lesbians in rural Georgia, our newsletter was often the only sign that they were not alone. For organizations in other cities and states, we were part of their vast network for social change. In January 1977, the newsletter officially became Atalanta and was launched with a cover showing the Greek heroine Atalanta in the arms of a very furry bear. The first page read, Atalanta, a Greek woman from Arcadia who was exposed to die at birth. Our Atalanta was, however, found and suckled by a she-bear. Obviously, we were creative as well as political bunch. Every issue had a calendar of our events, monthly meeting minutes, committee reports, phone numbers of those with keys to the Alpha House, lesbian news from around the world, announcements of radical activities in Atlanta, book and record reviews, and just plain old opinions. The Alpha newsletter shows us in every issue how hardworking we were, how political, how out, long before TV programs and AIDS. Even as our organization shrank in the late 80s due to the integration of lesbians into the wider world and less of a need for us to fight for recognition and acceptance, the newsletter continued to the very end, a symbol of everything we were and did. That's the story, but I feel compelled to say one more word because we're in the middle of a series of crises. If the Alpha newsletter it existed today, it will be covering the uprisings and rebellions now occurring. I wrote for the newsletter for many years, and I always reported on all the intersecting struggles happening in Atlanta and the US that touched folks in many of the LGBTQI communities that existed in Atlanta. Those political reports were side by side with information about goddess worship and Wiccan workshops and yearly Pride celebrations. So I remember the newsletter fondly, and I hope that we will continue to fight against what I call the patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist system we are now in.
Yes, thank you, Lorraine. That is a wonderful segue. So my name's E.R. Anderson, and I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. I'm going to close us out for the readings, and then we're going to take some questions. I wrote a piece called Blueprint for a Feminist Bookstore Future, a personal history of Charis. It's a longer piece, so I'm just going to read some excerpts from it. And similar to what Lorraine is saying, we're living through this moment. I wrote this piece about 1.5 years ago, and pieces of it are very relevant, and then pieces of it feel like it was maybe written 10 years ago because so much has happened. So the first thing people usually say when they enter Charis Books and More is how homey the space feels, how safe. It is in part this feeling of warmth, of respite in an increasingly fractured world that has kept customers and program attendees returning to Charis for more than 45 years. I cannot write about Charis in an objective way because Charis raised me and made me so much of the person I am today. I came to Charis, as Alexis did, through the Young Women's Writers Program, run by Charis co-founder Linda Bryant in 1998, and have grown up within the walls of 1189 Euclid Avenue, honing my politics and my writing, making friends, finding my love, Charis Books co-owner Sarah Looslook, and ultimately finding myself as I have worked my way through many different roles and jobs within both Charis Books and Charis Circle. Because we have survived when many other feminist and independent bookstores have not, people want to know how we do it. As I write this in March of 2019, Charis is preparing to embark on a once-in-a-lifetime move to begin a partnership with Agnes Scott College, adding a third arm to our existing for-profit, nonprofit hybrid business model. We will retain our for-profit independent feminist bookstore, Charis Books and More, and our nonprofit programming and fundraising arm, Charis Circle, and add Charis at Agnes Scott College, a school store serving the needs of the Agnes Scott College community. This is our story. And I'm going to move forward I'm going to skip the part that many of you probably are most familiar with, which is the Charis story of 1974 to 1995. And I'm going to go to Big Charis, Charis Books and Charis Circle, 1996 to 2006. Linda Bryant was able to effectively fundraise from diverse communities to support the work of Charis Circle and build its formal program structure to include standard bookstore fare like open mics and author events, but also women's sexuality programs, a thriving girls to women mentorship program called Gaia Girls, which I was also a part of, a young women's writing group that launched the careers of many teen writers, and a number of events around faith and feminism. The Circle hired an executive director, programming staff, and additional fundraising staff at various points through this 10-year period, and was assisted at all times by a board of directors made up of a racially and economically diverse group of women who identified as lesbian, bisexual, queer, and straight. One of the primary benefits of this model is the way that it invites community members to engage with feminist ideas in a variety of contexts and modes. A casual book browser who wandered in off the streets of Little Five Points might discover that Charis Circle offers support groups or events that help them solve a problem, make new friends, or build community. During the first 5 years of this period, Charis Books employed 4 full-time staff members and had its highest grossing sales year ever. But eventually, competition from big box stores and Amazon, plus the cooling off of feminist and leftist activism in Atlanta after 9/11, as well as major staffing changes and the planned buyout and retirement of Linda Bryant, ushered in another 10-year period of challenges and innovation. Surviving new technology and the economy, 2007 to 2017. In 2007, 2 major technologies impacted the bookselling industry in ways previously unimagined. That year saw the release of both the iPhone and the Amazon Kindle. These 2 technologies dramatically changed the way people read, and communicate, and their advent hit all bookstores very hard. Charis was affected in a very specific way. Since the 1970s, rural lesbians from around Georgia and the Deep South made Charis a destination on road trips and business vacations, summer vacations, and when stopping through Atlanta on business trips if possible. Rural and suburban women from all over the South filled the store on Saturday and Sundays and often walked out with armfuls of books from lesbian publishers like Bella and Bold Strokes, books to read and pass along to other lesbians in their communities. The advent of the iPhone and the Kindle introduced a new ease and accessibility for rural readers of these lesbian presses. They no longer had to drive all the way to Atlanta and fight traffic to browse the books they loved. Now they could easily download them to their phones and Kindles straight from the Bella website or from Amazon. What was gained in convenience and privacy was lost in community. Seemingly overnight, huge swaths of Charis' most loyal customers simply stopped coming, or came only once a year instead of 6 or 12 times a year. The loss was immediate and painful. At almost the same time, we had the world financial crisis and the Great Recession. The last decade has been incredibly difficult and close to the bone scary for all of us who work day in and day out to hold Charis in trust for the community. So much of our survival has been based on luck, geography, and an instinct to fight for our home, even when it didn't look like a smart decision on paper. That, as of this writing, we are finally in a place that looks like success, has as much to do with luck as it does with love and hard work. To pretend otherwise is to do a disservice to all those brilliant, creative, hardworking feminist booksellers who decided for myriad reasons that it no longer made sense to go on. It also is a disservice to the exciting new feminist and radical bookshops opening around the world each year who need an honest blueprint for the future. With hindsight, it's comforting to see that the economic struggles we experienced at Charis as deeply personal map neatly onto the timeline of the downturn and recovery from the Great Recession of 2007. Our co-founder, Linda Bryant, retired at the end of 2006, and the leadership transition was especially difficult for Charis Circle, as a nonprofit's ability to fundraise and build community and programs is only as good as its network. The combination of some of Linda's network departing with her, as the recession constraining our constituents' ability to make as many philanthropic gifts as they once could, was devastating and took about 7 years to recover from. Although strong fundraising associated with our 35th birthday in 2009 allowed us to hang on, we continued to struggle economically, as well as in building back the relationships that had weakened since Linda led the circle. At the end of 2012, after 3 years as program director, I became executive director of the Charis Circle. Because of my long history at Charis and my deep relationships with so many people in the community, I was able to rebuild some of the lost relationships with longtime donors. From 2013 through 2015, Charis Circle and Charis Books engaged in a listening tour and explored partnerships for Charis's financial sustainability that included talking to other nonprofits and community organizations, land banks and co-ops, alternative lending communities, a bakery, a coffee shop, and finally several colleges and universities, including Spelman College and Agnes Scott College. Agnes Scott and beyond, 2014 to 2019. When Agnes Scott College Women's Studies professor Beth Hackett casually suggested over lunch one day in 2014 that it would be really cool for Charis to be the official bookstore of Agnes Scott College, I thought it sounded like a really nice fantasy. Still, at Beth's prodding, Sarah Look and I wrote a proposal to then college president Elizabeth Quiche about a new kind of bookstore partnership where Agnes Scott students could, of course, buy books and t-shirts, but also learn about feminism in community with people of all ages and backgrounds. We were also clear that we didn't want to be a traditional textbook retailer. President Quiche was a longtime fan of Charis and saw it as a visionary possibility. And so in 2015, Charis Books and Charis Circle began the formal process of creating a partnership with Agnes Scott College. The end product, a jointly renovated historic home on South Candler Street, directly across from the contiguous campus of Agnes Scott College, shares many of the homey, warm feelings of 1189 Euclid Charis House. Like so many things in the history of Big Charis, undertaking the renovation of a historic building with very little experience in capital projects fundraising ended up coming together with a lot of help and a lot of faith and hard work. Because the space would greatly increase Charis Circle's daytime programming space and functioning, the Circle was able to fundraise for the majority of the building. Agnes Scott does own the building, but Charis Books and Charis Circle have a joint lease that is expected to renew in perpetuity. The Charis Books and Charis Circle is one of the most deeply and historically interracial, intergenerational, multi-gendered, radically inclusive feminist bookstores in the country, is due most clearly to the unique history of Atlanta. Its majority Black city center with a historically Black Atlanta University complex, as well as Atlanta's historic reputation as a destination for the LGBTQ South. For decades, Atlanta has drawn LGBTQ people from small and medium-sized towns and cities in Georgia and in neighboring states. That Charis Books and Charis Circle have been able to survive and thrive in such a radically diverse city is due mostly to our community's ongoing commitment to use feminism as a tool for growth, which necessarily includes mistakes, failures, heartbreaks, and new starts. The current co-owners of Charis are both white lesbians, and I am a white, queer, transmasculine person. Our board of directors is majority Black women. We thrive in part because we stay in struggle rather than shy away from it. Because we reject the politics of disposability. We keep coming back to the table and try to bring people along in the work. Charis has struggled with racism, classism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, and more. but that struggle has been key to its longevity. Because Charis is an institution in the living and breathing world, it is only as good as the people who call it home. Charis has been most successful when its leadership and community members have tried hard things, had painful conversations, and kept going with vulnerability and a commitment to feminist anti-racist ethics. That commitment includes the ongoing building of a succession plan that seeks to build Black leadership within both Charis Books and Charis Circle so that the next generation of leaders and owners are not white. What Charis might offer other bookstores and other nonprofits is a model that suggests that if an organization is clear in its vision and values, even when the popularity of those values and vision waxes and wanes, it can weather the tides of an unjust economic system. Charis Books and Charis Circle opened at 184 South Candler on April 1st, 2019. We had our most economically successful year in decades last year. And even in the midst of this pandemic, in the historic uprisings that are happening right now that we hope will transform our society at every level, we're finding that the hunger for anti-racist, feminist, and queer texts is stronger than ever. May it always be so. So now we are going to open up. Yeah, thank you, y'all. Now we're going to open it up for folks to ask questions in the chat. We're going to ask that you keep it on mute just because it gets really chaotic. But if you want to type your questions in the chat, we will address them. You can address them to everyone. You can address them to specific people. But if you have specific questions, please feel free to start typing, and we'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes answering questions. Barbara asks, was the prior bookstore at Agnes Scott one of the B&N bookstores? No, it was a Follett bookstore. So Julie Enszer asks, can we talk about what we're selling and recommending to folks at this moment? And if you go to our Charis homepage, which I'm going to just put in the chat right now, if you scroll down to about the middle of the page, we've put all of our book lists about racism and anti-racism in the middle of the page. And so some of our most popular book lists right now are Understanding and Dismantling Racism, a book list for white readers, books to teach white children and teens how to understand and dismantle racism and white supremacy. We just finished a Transformative Justice and Prison Abolition book list, which is really, really significant and important right now. We have a hashtag Say Her Name list, which was inspired by the murder of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky. So specifically about the ways that Black women are targeted and imperiled by criminal injustice system and by the police, and looking at the intersection of misogyny and anti-Blackness. So those are some of our most popular lists. But we are selling, as everyone in the country, is a lot of white fragility. That is true. But we really recommend just going and looking at these lists and scrolling down until you find one that is in stock, and we will gladly send it to you. So Julie wants to know, Carol, what is your favorite memory from publishing the Feminist Bookstore News?
Favorite memory. I'm going to talk for a minute about one of my favorite memories as a bookseller at Old Wives' Tales. And that was that we were located, in the middle of everything. And the Catholic Girls High School was a few blocks away, and they turned out, the first year we were open, they came in at that time when, juniors and seniors were required to write term papers. And then they came in the next year. And we had noticed that a lot of lesbian books disappeared in that moment. And that the second year, there was a very clear effort to distract all the staff members while some women access lesbian literature. And so, that took us 2 years to figure out. So this next year, we very cleverly put all the teenage lesbian books, well, actually we ordered extras and put them all face front through the lesbian section. And and turned our backs and kind of let the girls have at it. And, you know, while I generally don't encourage people to shoplift from movement bookstores, I think there's a moment, especially for young people, especially in those scary coming out moments, when our job as booksellers was just to get the ideas and the words and the visions and the safety into women's hands by any means necessary. And in those cases, it was shoplifting. Sometimes it was putting books into our library for someone who couldn't afford it. But it was that passion for getting books out into the world. I think some of my favorite memories of Feminist Bookstore News and the Feminist Bookstore Network, well, for me, were stories of booksellers telling me that when it came, they would take a lunch hour, which they didn't do most of the time, and just sit down with it and read it, because we were all so hungry to see ourselves and to, you know, FBN was a way for booksellers to meet up with our peers. So especially in smaller stores, being the only person in the town, maybe you're the only one who knew that the reason you didn't have this book that someone came in and wanted was because it was out of stock, that the publisher didn't have it. And so people were mad at you. But it was nice to have that few minutes with your peers who knew that you had done everything possible and who respected all of the work that you did. So sometimes I think we were a mirror and a support system for each other. And that was, you know, the best thing. And getting together at the conferences and events and being together with all these feminist booksellers. Those are a few of my favorite things.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So Megan Lau, who is one of the co-founders of Burdock Book Collective in Alabama, asked, as a new bookstore, we are struggling to find ways of building and sustaining community in a time when it is hard to share physical space with each other. Does anyone have ideas on this? And I think this is for everyone, not just the booksellers on this thread. So I think y'all did this pre-internet, and you were so pioneering in terms of how you utilized, you know, all of these different, you know, networking tools. So I'm wondering, do you have organizing tips in this moment?
When I heard the question, I realized that even though there wasn't an internet and it wasn't cell phones and those we still had to connect with people pretty directly. Our network grew by people talking with their friends and people discussing things in the bar they went to, going to bars and handing out leaflets, because the newsletter had to start growing the people who would get the newsletter by that same method. So it was very important to have that physical connection and meeting someone somewhere. So really it's mind-boggling for me to think about a bookstore just having started, and now this happened with the stay at home and don't go, and wow. So I don't know, doing what we used to do is always available even more nowadays on the internet. So the internet existing is like, to me, it's a lifesaver with all these Zoom meetings and ways to communicate with each other and at least see each other, if not actually feel and hug each other. So I love Zoom. I'm glad that all these different platforms exist.
Yeah, Julie says in the chat, not everything works, but those failures, failure to attract people, failure to do things right, failure to connect, make a basis for future opportunities. I would definitely second that. Some of the best things for Charis have come out of things that have been things that I felt like were disasters in the moment. I've learned a lot from the things that didn't work out or that we only had 5 people show up to. So sometimes the things that you just feel really bad about in the moment can really be generative, because you think about, oh, well, what would have worked if, you know, or how could I have connected with folks? Someone says we used to have phone trees. One woman calls the next, and so on. It can be done through email now. Rose says a friend has a local toy store and no website. She told me she's doing a lot of phone orders and curbside delivery, even home delivery and Facebook, but that's just how she is selling toys, which would work for books too. Every bookstore needs a website and an email list. Share lists with simpatico organizations if you can, or have them put a blurb about you in their news. Yeah.
This is Phyllis Free here.
Hey, Phyllis.
I think this relates to what you were just talking about, and I'm just curious, has there been historically a tradition of feminist bookstores around the country working together to support each other, or was there more of a sense early on of businesses being in competition with each other?
Carol, will you answer that?
Yes, there was a huge, intense, mutually supportive connection among feminist booksellers. I know some of the publishers felt more competitive because they all wanted the same authors or what have you. And, but booksellers, we were pretty much community-based. So we were not competing. You know, there wasn't an internet. There wasn't, it wasn't even possible if, you know, if you lived in New York, you went to that bookstore. If you lived in Buffalo, you went to that bookstore. If you lived in Atlanta, you went to that bookstore. If you were in Tennessee, you went to Merril. It was, you know, whatever was, it was local. So we were not competitive.
Yeah.
And in fact, we bent over backwards to compete. And we published jointly such things like the Feminist Bookstore Network catalog that listed all the feminist bookstores in the back, and all the stores circulated it. We did a lot to support each other.
Well, I'm thinking with today's technology, many of the things that Lorraine was talking about, and it seems so obvious to us now that what we can do through social media is kind of like, you know, whatever groups you belong to on the internet, then that's sort of like your local bar where you tell other people about stuff. I mean, that's basically what we've got, that analogy. And so I think it would be interesting to look in terms of new feminist bookstores and booksellers that are coming along. How can some of those same principles be applied that Carol CJ was talking about, but that don't have to do with the geography of the physical space? But what would be some ways to work cooperatively to support each other and help promote each other? And whether that means that certain bookstores kind of specialize in things that somebody else specializes in something else, and that way you're trading referrals back and forth. I don't know that makes sense, but I think it would be good to look at what we have now as kind of like going to the bars and going word of mouth in terms of spreading the word, but also looking at ways to work cooperatively with others that will help promote each other's businesses, and how, you know, to look for ways, come up with ways that makes sense outside of, since the geographic part doesn't hold like it used to.
Audrey May, yes, that's a great idea, Phyllis. Thank you. Audrey May says, as a former bookseller, our experience was that we had huge support from other feminist bookstores. Shout out here to Linda Bryant, who gave us a huge boost in 1990 when we just got started, when she sent Alice Walker's publishers rep to us. She says, remember publishers rep, we do still have them, to us, and got us connected with Alice for a phenomenal event that really got us started. So that's great. Is important to say. Rose, will you talk about the next issue in this series, please?
Yes, this is the 5th of a projected 6 issues. And the sixth one will be out year after next, but it's on the subject of what we're calling it rights and rights, feminist spirituality and women's rights activists combined. We have stories about women's circles, and I'm writing a story about the Pagoda Temple of Love, which may have been the second goddess church in the country that was in Florida. And then we have another section of based on interviews with just women's stories, including some about experiences in AA and lesbians coming to Christianity and how they dealt with the way that Christianity in the South treated homosexuality. So it's going to be a really interesting final issue, and Sinister Wisdom will be then publishing the whole set, all 6 copies as a box set.
Wonderful. So thank you very much to Julie Enszer for helping sustain this work through Sinister Wisdom. I hope that folks will go to sinisterwisdom.com, or excuse me, sinisterwisdom.org, and check out all of the back issues that you can purchase. There are amazing issues outside of this series as well. Of course, we're biased towards the South, but there are many, many great issues. And the whole series is available to purchase. They're all great. You can also purchase them from this issue in particular, from our link on our website. We would love to ship it out to you right away. And I just want to thank everyone who read tonight. This has been a really exciting experience for me to get to be with all of you and learn with all of you. I'm grateful to everyone who joined us on this event. It's been wonderful to see the community going on in the chat and to see the connections. Again, if you are a former or current feminist bookseller, or you hope to be one soon, I hope that you will join us on July 18th for an intergenerational chat about feminist bookselling and how we can support one another into the future. As always, we would love for you to follow Charis online. We're doing a ton of events all the time online now, and we plan to do that throughout 2020 at the very least. So please follow us wherever you are in the world. We would love to be your remote feminist bookseller. I hope that you all stay safe and well out there, and that you contribute, to justice in whatever way you are able to at this moment. Many of you have lived lives of justice for your entire life, and I'm personally grateful to you for that. And you've really been a role model to me. So thank you for your work. Thank you to all of you in the chat. Please be safe and well out there. And until Sinister Wisdom, the 6th in the series, we hope to have you all back for that. But until next time, take care.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Yes, turn on your mics and say goodnight.
Hello. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody, great to see you.
Love you. We
Bye.
love you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Love you. So good. So good.
Be fabulous women.
Bye.
Miss you.
Wonderful to see you all.
I need hugs. Give me hugs.
Yes, hugs.
Hugs.